Professor Les Heathcote from Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. It's a great privilege to have you here, Les. It's a long way to Australia from Europe. Today I'd just like you to tell me something of your own background, where you come from, and what were some of the formative influences on your particular style of geography.
Well, thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to join you today, and particularly on such a beautiful day here in Paris. Well, I was born in England, in the northwest part of Derbyshire. My contacts with geography was through school, of course, and really, I suppose, going on to university in geography was in part by chance. It was a subject which, of the three I took, seemed to be the best one I had. General interest in the subject, but I must admit that by the end of my undergraduate period at the University College in London, with no reflection on my teachers, I had had enough of geography, and I was in a sense very pleased to have the chance to get away from it. And at the time I completed my studies there in 1955, it was a time when, of course, national service was required in Britain. And so I had then 2 years in the British Army, in national service, and I had, by chance, the very good fortune of going to Cyprus, which is a beautiful island in my view. I think has most of the attractions one could hope for an island, in the sense that it has high mountains, forests, it has the possibility of skiing. In fact, the British Army taught me to ski, and that was at the time when Mr. Khrushchev was threatening dire retribution on Europe, so we thought maybe we were going to be sent to Siberia. Luckily we weren't, but we were taught to ski. It has wonderful beaches. It has the famous old city of Salamis, which the earthquake dropped below sea level, and you can go scuba diving and see the archaeological remains there. But it also has a rather interesting semi-arid area in the rain shadow of the Troodos Mountains. And during a truce in the internal period of unrest at the time of Inosis and the Oka, there was a period of truce, and with 2 other comrades I hired bicycles, and we went round the island, sort of sleeping in people's backyards and vineyards and so on, and that, I suspect, renewed my interest, particularly in the arid or semi-arid environment. And as a result of renewed interest and having renewed contacts with Professor Darby, who was the professor at the University College, I suspect largely through his good offices, I was able to get a scholarship, a Fulbright scholarship, to go on to the University of Nebraska.
But Les, before you leave Cyprus now, the experience of that geographical environment which you described very well here, was that very different from what you had been taught as an undergraduate that geography was?
Yes, it in a sense it brought things alive, which up to then had just been things on paper. We had had a very good training in geography. We had had experience on the continent in field trips and so on. In fact, I have a photograph of our field trip which went to Germany under Professor Zinnhuber, now in Vienna. And on that photograph is Professor Mabegunji and Darby, of course, and Professor Zinnhuber and so on. And also Brian Berry on the same photograph. We had a group at the same time from LSE who were doing the Bachelor of Economics in Geography, and Brian was amongst them. Yes, it brought it alive, and I think just seeing these new landscapes and realizing that they pose different questions, and to try and explain them would need was a challenge. And I think the idea of man and aridity and the problem of coping with that first began an interest which maybe was latent, dormant, and that experience suddenly brought it into focus.
So you got your fellowship to America then?
Well, yes, it was a Fulbright scholarship to Nebraska, and I had 2 years there under Professor Leslie Hughes, and I joined a fellow student at that time was Martin Bowden, who had been at University College, but just because of the timing, I think he actually was a couple of years behind me at University College, but because of my time in the Army, we came together in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we shared a room together for 2 years, so we survived that experience. But we had a very interesting time there. Both of us, I think, appreciated the Great Plains environment particularly, and it renewed my interest in the way in which, if you like, a European based culture had tried to come to grips with what was essentially a rather new, or at least a different environment, particularly in the semi-arid subhumid fringe. And Leslie Hughes put both Martin and myself onto a body of data which we used. This was a body of historical data of a farm loan company which was operating in the 19th century, 1880s, I think it was, and which gave and as a process of lending money to farmers, had produced very detailed field notebooks for the guidance of its surveyors, I suppose you would call them. And Martin was able to use these as part of his interest in the developing changing land use in the eastern part of Nebraska. And I was particularly interested in them because they gave an evaluation of the land in the sense of actually both dollars and cents at one stage, but also in terms of a land grade. And this was an evaluation of the land's agricultural potential. And the thing which had disturbed me a little bit about previous work I'd seen in what we would now think of as perception was the lack of any real attempt to try to, I hesitate to use the word quantification because it means so much now more than it did when I was trying to do this sort of work, but the lack of any attempt to put numbers or to put some relative objective evaluation onto the appraisal of places. And this body of data, Farm Loan Company records, gave a very useful, fairly large body of data for most of eastern Nebraska, and even stretching up, I think, into part of the Dakotas, about this time, 1870s and 80s, where you could actually put a relative value on land at that time, and you could then go back, and as I tried to do in my MA thesis, you could then go back to the original land survey documents where there was some attempt at classifying the soil, first, second and third class. You could compare that with this 1870, 1880 material, and you could try and bring it up to the present time, or the 1940s, the sort of land use capability studies. And you could, in fact, build up for a limited area. I took a couple of counties just for the sake of a sample area. You could build up a series of profiles of the relative evaluation of, for example, the bottomland and the upland and the rolling loess hills and so on. And those changed through time as a function of various things, technology, discovery of water, transport change and so on. So you could actually document it, and you could say this was more or less than that and how much and so on. So that was one of the, plus the sort of experience of going with fellow colleagues, students on field trips and also privately through the Great Plains, the Nebraska Sand Hills and all this country. We sort of...
But you did an innovative thing with that data, Les, and maybe not everybody knows about it. You didn't do a traditional geographic study, land evaluation. You looked at the perceptions of people, how people perceived things. Could you talk a little bit more about just that? I think it was an innovative step that both you and Martin took at that time, long before we ever heard of perception in the field. Would you like to talk a little bit about it?
Well, I think both Martin and myself were influenced or had been impressed by John Kirtland Wright's work, of course, and geography. In fact, I called my thesis Historical Geography of Two Nebraska Counties. I'm not sure whether it was an original use. It was from John K. Wright's use of the term. And of course people say, oh, it's too close to theosophy, you shouldn't have that. So I don't sort of shout too loud about that. But yes, it was just as an attempt to try to see and to identify the different points of view about the environment. You had the surveyors, the official surveyors. You then had this private company surveying it for very, in a sense, fairly material purposes in terms of what they were trying to assess was the agricultural productivity potential of this area. And this was in terms of their thinking at the time. And this, of course, changed over time, and it was perhaps enabled me to recognize the need to identify the various points of view about an area which you would need to try and study.
And then you went to Australia right away after?
No, I finished in Nebraska in sort of the mid-year. I went back to England and I taught at a local high school for a term till the Christmas of 59. And then I went out to the National University in Canberra early in the year of 1960. And I did my doctorate there under Professor Cite. And actually, for part of the time I was there, Joe Jennings was my effective supervisor, and I just heard a couple of days ago that he, rather tragically, he's just died. He is one of the great geomorphologists, but he was very, as a Dr. Father, you would say in German, he was a very inspiring person to be in contact with. And then Professor Spake came and took over when he was overseas for a year, and he came back and I was working under him.
I see. And the thesis subject?
Well, when I saw the chance of going to Australia, I saw an advertisement while I was in Nebraska for scholarships at the National University. And I was already, through the Nebraska experience, very interested in, particularly in the semi-arid, so the Cyprus, Nebraska. It reinforces interest in Europeans on the edge of the desert, if you like, and the difficulties and the problems they faced, practical problems, mental problems of adjusting and coping with the stresses of the environment. The chance of going to Australia seemed to fit logically.
Yes.
And so when I went to Australia, I really tried to do a rather similar sort of thing, again trying to document a bit more precisely change in attitude and evaluation of places over time. And the study, the Bakker-Burke study, was of an area of northwestern New South Wales and southwestern Queensland, which was the local name was the Warrego country because it focused on the Warrego River, which, like all good Australian rivers, flows when it rains. The rest of the time it's a series of mud puddles down through the countryside. That's not fair. They're water holes. They're very good water holes, but it's not a flowing river.
Yes.
And there the documentation was based on a series of government reports in good Australian fashion whenever there was a problem, whether it was a problem in the coal mines, dockers, agricultural settlement. They formed a select committee or a royal commission, and as a result of which there was a whole series of data collected together, evidence given. And in the turn of the century, there was a major drought in the interior of Australia which affected the prospects of land settlement and required a major royal commission, which massive source of evidence, great volume of stuff. So then that encouraged me to look at this particular area, and I chose this semi-arid area lying astride this political division, because Australia even now is not one unity, it's a series of effectively independent states in terms of their land use policy and so on, land management policy, to try and see if there's any major difference between the two within this semi-arid zone. The data that was mainly available were the rental assessments, because this is all pastoral leasehold country. It's never been sold, unlike, of course, the United States. And you had, over a series of years, from the 1850s through to when I was working on them into the late 1950s, almost 100 years of record of the evaluation of the rental to be paid on the leasehold. Now that rental in effect was an assessment of the pastoral production potential, grazing stock numbers and so on. And that again, you could, if you took the basic pattern of terrain, different types of terrain and associated vegetation associations, you could then compare that with the evaluation over time, and again you had this fluctuation which reflected. The obvious thing was the artesian basin discovery in the 1880s, which immediately meant that water was no longer a problem. Up to then, water had been the main limiting factor. Thereafter, water was no longer a problem. Then, thereafter, the vegetation became more important, and so on. But sorry.
You've looked mainly at the objective assessments as recorded in, say, the managerial interest. Have you looked into the occupants' perceptions?
Well, the other side of two sides to that. One in the actual royal commissions, particularly in the 19th century in Australia, and I suspect in other parts of the British colonial areas. The Royal Commission not only published its report of its findings, but usually in the 19th century they published the minutes of evidence. And quite often in terms of volume of material, it's the minutes of evidence are many times the size of the original report. Now in the minutes of evidence, you have everyone who ever gave any evidence to the Commission, what they said precisely written down. So every farmer, every pastoralist, every stock and station agent, what he said is written down there. A very impressive body of data, which is what lends itself, of course, now to very detailed content analysis. When I was working, it was a case of a rather more quick overview of opinions, but of course quoting and so on. Opinions. It was very interesting to see people who said something one day and then came back the next day and said, but I didn't really mean that, I meant something else. But of course the record is there and you've got both the two sorts of opinions. So that's one thing. So that was a very useful source of, one day I'll write a paper which will be called Interviewing the Dead, which will be looking at these sorts of information, because it's still a very valuable source. The other thing which I came across by chance was a very stimulating series of, just one book at the time, but then a subsequently stimulating series of books by the Australian art historian Bernard Smith. And his thesis, Place, Taste and Tradition, was, in my view, a sort of a masterly review of the way in which the art, in the broadest sense, really he was talking about graphic art of the Pacific, particularly the British and the French, had reflected attitudes to the Pacific, which showed through the paintings and so on. And through his ideas, I tried to incorporate, looking back on it now very crudely in that Zuckerberg study, the general attitudes to the Australian environment that were evident sort of through the art historians' interpretations of their meaning in that. So that, in a sense, the thesis, the Zuckerberg study, was in three different scales. The first scale was a sort of a general overview, looking at secondary sources about what had happened in the interior and how it had been assessed and evaluated, but incorporating Bernard Smith's, the art historian's view of recognition of environment through art history. Then the sort of the detailed stuff of the pastoral rental assessments over time, and then finally focusing in on a very small case study of an actual, it was small in the sense of relation to the rest of Australia, but it was a pastoral property of 1 million acres in the 1880s, which had very detailed records, so you could actually see to what extent this case study reflected a broader pattern of things. Luckily, it seemed to fit reasonably well.
That was a rich and complex endeavour. It seems to me you have just as much an interest in history and the historical development of things as you do in just any synchronic snapshot.
Yes. Well, that, of course, I suspect I owe to Professor Darby and his colleagues back at University College, who did a very good job in selling us that the recognition that to understand the present, you must look in part to the past.
Of course. Have you done some comparative work or planned comparative work between, say, the Great Plains of North America and Australia, the arid environments and semi-arid environments?
Yes, not as much as I would like. That's a project in the future, but two areas. One, a fairly early study, which was of an attempt to compare pastoral development between the American Southwest, really, as a whole, a very, fairly broadly defined Southwest, arid USA, and Australia, which was called the pastoral ethic, which was a study of, or trying to see if there was in fact a distinctive ethic in the resource management in the pastoral context. I think there was, certainly in the 19th century, rather exploitive. And I think in the 19th century they could get away with it in the short term, but the consequences of that are now still with us, of course, the long-term impacts of exploitation of the rangeland. And more recently, a very brief paper comparing, that again, at a fairly elementary level at this stage, the depiction and evaluation of the landscapes of the Great Plains in Australia through landscape paintings, a paper in the Great Plains Quarterly. At a fairly elementary level, tries to see that there are some interesting parallels in terms of how the societies, through their painters, reflect attitudes to the environment.
Yes, this is what's exceptional, I think, about your approach to perception, a word that's used to mean so many different things.
Sure.
You're not confined to interaction with, say, psychology and sociology in your interpretations. You go into the humanities and painting for insight. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, as I say, the interest in a sense came through my contact with the works of Bernard Smith, and both my wife and I have got a sort of a hobby, an interest in landscape painting as a means of depicting and communicating ideas about the environment. So that we are both interested in trying to use this. In fact, part of the time while I'm here in Paris, I hope to, of course, make the pilgrimage to the Louvre and get the good word there. But we're trying to look at the role of landscape painting, and I've just been on a commission, geographic tourism in the Alps, and of course there was quite a significant role of landscape painting in developing tourism, in the sense that in many cases, particularly the late 18th, 19th century landscape painters were one of the group of media, in a sense, which presented information about the alpine environment to a ever-widening clientele, and in a sense who not only presented information but in a sense educated people to what to look for. And so that I think in explaining the development of tourism in the Alps, you would certainly, if you had a book on it, for example, you would need to have a section, maybe a chapter or something, on the role of landscape painting in the development of the Alps as an environment recognized to be of aesthetic value. Part of the aesthetics appreciation coming through the work of the landscape painters and so on.
So your approach to landscape painting, unlike, we'll say, some other humanistic geographers, is not, you're not looking at it to give you insight into the nature of the Alps. You're regarding it as one kind of perception or one method that was used to project an image of the Alps.
Well, yes, except that I think we would probably also try, if we could. I mean, that I'd mentioned the tourist as the projection side of it as an illustration because of the tourist link. I'm not sure that either my wife or myself are sort of really competent to look at the second of those aspects you mentioned, but it certainly is an area that we're looking at to see to what extent you can, through the landscape painting, discover the relationship of the artist with the environment, and particularly the environment as a geographical phenomena. I think maybe the geographer has something to offer to the art historians in their interpretation of present and past attempts at depicting landscape, environment.
Yes. Yes, it was Alexander von Humboldt's
dream.
Of
course.
Yes. Now, you, as you know, the whole field of perception has gone through a period of enthusiasm and is now somewhat in the wane. You still believe in this approach, and why?
Yes, I still believe in the approach, the need to look at people's attitudes and to try to understand them, to try to understand the learning process that we all have and go through. I think part of the problem currently may be the difficulty of documenting it, of providing some basic work studies, which people could build on. I think we have many ideas, hypotheses, but we have rather few as yet major works which have tried to test those hypotheses and produce some sort of definitive study of how these hypotheses do or do not work in a quote, real world situation. I think maybe some of the problems of the humanistic approach currently, in my view, seem to be that we now are at a stage where we have lots of hypotheses to look at, to check. We need to get on with the job of testing them, applying them to the Alps or wherever it needs to be done.
And empirical testing out would still be the criterion for credibility.
Well, I think so. That's my personal view. That if I cannot find some sort of empirical evidence to support the hypothesis, then I'm rather skeptical about its validity. I mean, I'm open to be convinced, but I think that maybe it's the training that we had as undergraduates, the sort of emphasis. I mean, we were trained up in the positivist mode, obviously, and it's very difficult as geographers to get away from the earth and the soil and the soles of your boots, so that we are naturally, I suspect, biased to the empirical study.
Yes, but if you want to explain now these different evaluations of the Great Plains or the Australian map, you either have to explain it in terms of individual learning process or perception, or you resort to the conventional assumptions about what real estate dealers will need or want, what private agents will need or want. In other words, you're falling back on either stereotypical models of how business should work or how rationality should work. You're not looking into cultural groups and their values and attitudes.
Oh, well, you would need to, yes, you would need to do that. I mean, the work that I did on the plains in Australia was, in a sense, it certainly was not a comprehensive view of the appraisal of the plains. It was, in the case of the Nebraska study, that was a view of the agricultural potential as seen through a series of viewpoints, including the very practical one of the real estate farm loan companies, but also the first land surveyors who were trying to pick out reasonable land for land settlement. Practically, materially oriented. And to some extent also the same bias would be true of the Australian study. The art history component was perhaps a broader, more culturally oriented view. But, I wouldn't say that this is the only way to do it. I must say, right from the word go, I've been concerned to try, if we can, to provide some empirical evidence. Now, maybe the empirical evidence might be in terms of, for example, I'm just thinking now of a farmer I knew in the Mallee of the semi-arid part of South Australia, who lost his leg. His tractor rolled over on top of him, lost his leg, in hospital for several times. He was a man of great artistic ability, worked in leather, wrote poetry, and some of the best poetry of the impact of drought on wheat country is in some of his poetry. Now, in fact, in assessing the study of the perception of drought in that part of South Australia, one would have to include as an essential component of an overall view, if you're trying to get an overall. That is one element. We've done, as part of I was associated with Gilbert White's natural hazards work in drought, and as part of the study in the early 1970s, we did a sort of standard questionnaire survey. And of course, that's another side of it. It was a bit criticised as imposing a sort of cultural imprint. In fact, we modified the questionnaire to cope with the local situation, and I think there were practical problems and it didn't always work out. But looking back on it, it was a very useful means of getting local points of view and getting some rather wonderful descriptions of what drought meant. And maybe the best definition of drought I've ever come across was that one farmer said, a drought is when you see two mallee trees fighting over a dog. Now that story is the Australian version, but I've seen an equivalent story, except that it's two cottonwood trees for the plains. Now whether it's just sort of independent innovation, I don't know, but there's no doubt there's the same story, the same environment, just you change the trees. So there's a whole, no, I'm not trying to say that in going for the empirical, I'm meaning empirical, I'm meaning something which you can try to document, whether it is poetry, whether it is an interview, a taped interview such as this, or some sort of data which can be reproducible later in time and can be then maybe reassessed, as history is, but is there for the record.
And would you still require a positivist way of handling this empirical evidence still?
Up to a point, I suppose, in the sense that to the extent that you would need to maybe consider the evidence and see whether there's more evidence for on this side or on the other, to sort of try and weigh up, if in that sense, a positive sort of evaluation of maybe counting up numbers of ideas one across the other.
And you see future for perceptual research in geography?
Yes. I think it's very important to continue it. I always remember one of these wonderful throwaway lines which Professor Darby gave at one occasion, which I still think has a lot of value in it. He said, this is of course in a British context, so it doesn't quite apply to others, but he said, geography enables you to read your newspaper with understanding and take your walks with interest. Now, that's, of course, in British and Australia, you don't go for walks, you go for a drive, as in the States. But I think that the role of geography is partly a sort of still a popular one. I mean, I still have a lot of sympathy for the National Geographic. The fact that it sells an enormous number of copies shows that there is a basic public interest, still, innate curiosity about faraway places. And part of our job, I see, is to try and understand those faraway places. And one way of understanding why they're different is to try and look at the perception of the people living there and how they've been influenced by maybe people coming in, so on.
Yes, could I then ask you your perceptions of Australia? What is it like to work in Australia? You who were born in England and worked in America.
Well, I went to Australia because I felt if I was going to make any contribution, there are relatively fewer Australians, and therefore my chances of making a contribution which might be significant might be better there. Just statistically, you'll flick a coin and that's it. And then there was the arid areas. I mean, there was a possibility maybe of working in Britain and then obviously working in North Africa. But I went to Australia. It's a very fascinating country in many ways. I find it personally, my family find it a very pleasant place to live, and the traditional way, a good place to bring up your children. Mm-hmm. In some ways, it's been a little disappointing that we haven't had as good a group of students coming through. My only complaint about Australia is that we haven't been able to tap as good. We've had some very good students, that's not to say that we haven't, but we haven't had what I had hoped to be quite a fairly steady throughput of good quality students, and so we've had problems there, and that's my only real complaint. But otherwise, the research potential is so vast, and of course Australia, from the point of view of European settlement, was settled from the 19th century onwards by people, officials, who, for all we decry the bureaucracy, were very meticulous in amassing vast amounts of data. Census data, these royal commissions, the official records in the various state archives, so that there is a vast body of data from which one can study the evolution of the present-day Australian landscape. And of course, Australia at the moment is going through a very interesting period, from the 1960s and 70s onwards has been in terms of its changing cultural relationship with Asia, mm-hmm. taking in fairly large numbers of boat people, much more cosmopolitan society. Even between the time when I came out as a research scholar in 1960 and going back in 1966 to Adelaide, I could see the difference in terms of just restaurants and so on, a much more cosmopolitan air about it. And so its position vis-à-vis Southeast Asia, I think politically and culturally, is becoming rather interesting. And there are strains, there are problems. But it's got to be a very exciting place to be, I think, the next 10 years or so.
That is very nice to hear. Would you like to say a word on your present major research curiosity? What are you working on just now?
Well, with Professor McCaskill, I'm involved in the Atlas. In 1988, the Australians have their bicentennial, of course. And all the historians are all geared up, and the historical geographers are sort of tagging along manfully behind, because relatively few numbers are involved. But people like Joe Powell is very heavily involved. And Professor McCaskill and myself are involved in one of the atlases, the atlas of historical geography, which we put out for the 1988 bicentennial, and I'm also involved in, I've just finished a chapter for a book by the historians. It's interesting, the historians have rediscovered two things: one, the region, and B, the cross-section through time. So that they, as part of their contribution, the historians have sliced Australian history: 1788, 1838, 1888, 1938, 1988. And I've been involved in the 1888 chapters of Australia, 1888. Mm-hmm. That's on this. To work with historians is very interesting because we have several very good economic historians who are, in a sense, really historical geographers in all but name.
Yes.
So we've got on very well there. So that's one side, and I'm still interested in the development of the arid interior and the problems of resource management. There currently is a whole problem of degradation, Aboriginal land rights, a whole series of resource management questions which are currently being debated, and which, luckily, the people who are doing the debating are at least beginning to be aware of the historical background to the present problems. And so I'm somewhat involved in that too.
Fascinating. So you'll not only have your centennial in 1888, you will also host the IGU Congress.
Yes, yes, we will be rather busy in 1988.
So we look forward to maybe seeing you again then, and I want to thank you so much for coming today and telling us of your background. Good luck to
Okay,
you.
well, thank you very much for the chance to talk to you.
Thank you.
Good. Bye-bye.
Bra?
Good? Okay.
Ungefär 40.